Welcome to For the Church, a podcast for the flock of Zion Presbyterian Church in Columbia, Tennessee. We want to help you think biblically about everyday matters. Zion Church exists to join Jesus and his mission to reach people with the gospel, and then to equip his people to worship and to serve. I'm your host, Keaton Paul, and joining me is my conversation partner and co-host, Seth Scruggs. Few things are more important to the Christian life than worship. In fact, worship in some capacity is why we get out of bed every morning. Yet, we see that the Bible takes worship incredibly seriously. How we relate to God is vital for us to think. But if you were to ask Christians how they related to God, they'd probably give you vague answers about feelings and routines. Yet all along, to know God and be known by God is really the ultimate goal and purpose of life. And so in this season, we want to explore Christian worship, what it is, and what we're called to do in it and by it. But first, hey Seth, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm good. I'm excited. It's been a very snowy week, and this is really the first time that I've been out of the house.
Yeah.
I was thinking this morning, I was like, I really hope that I can remember how to talk to another person and that I will have anything valuable to say.
Right.
And that my brain will be even slightly awake for this today.
You can only talk to cats for so long before you're like, people, there's this great thing about human contact and stuff. I do that. Now, granted, I'm also probably on the side of things where, you could give me a book and put me in a corner and then come back, 3 months and be like, hey, it's been 3 months. And, okay, well, cool. That's fun. So this past week has been amazing.
I've enjoyed it, but
it's time to get out.
Here.
Yeah, so here we're recording this on Friday of Snowmageddon, Snowpocalypse, if you will, January 2024. 24.
Yeah.
It's going to take me forever to get used to that. In my mind, it's still like 2019, but thank the Lord it's not. Still 2019.
I'm very glad that it is not.
We're past that. But yeah, it's Zion Road is a skating rink. The parking lot of Zion Presbyterian Church is not quite as much of a skating rink, and hopefully it'll be cleared off by the time we leave. But it is a cold, snowy winter wonderland outside. So I've got my handy dandy thermos here of warm Earl Grey tea, and I'm ready to talk about worship.
Yeah, me too. I'm so excited about this. I keep saying that for every podcast, but I'm really the more that I think about this topic and the more that we kind of prep and talk about it, I'm very excited.
Yeah.
So why don't you jump in? Why don't you start with what we're talking? What is worship?
Yeah.
Right?
What is worship? And this is one of the big questions that really kind of permeates a lot of Christian circles in our day, and it's looked like different things. So this has been, one of the more fascinating aspects in kind of my study of worship leading up to this podcast. Yeah, when I was at seminary, I took a class on the Theology of Worship with Ligon Duncan. It was an amazing class, loved it. So that this isn't my first lap with worship. This is something that I've had an interest in for some time. But this was an opportunity, kind of preparing for this season, was to dig deeper. And what's been amazing, I've read a lot of different books on a lot of different things, from a biblical theology of worship to more historical theologies of worship, what worship has looked like and how it was interpreted throughout the history of the church. And one of the interesting things that I've been able to read and kind of dip my toe into is kind of the cultural implications of what worship is. Really, in the past 40 years, has been very different things, even in the evangelical and reform circle. And so, when I first started reading, one of the first books that I read was John Frame wrote, one of our favorite guys, wrote a couple books on worship, and his book Worship in Spirit and in Truth, I think, was written in the 80s. And when he's kind of doing some cultural engagement in there at some point to kind of get at what broadly speaking, a lot of people consider worship to be. And when he was writing it in the 80s, when people said worship, what did they mean? In the 80s, at least according to Frame in Reformed and Evangelical circles, they meant almost exclusively preaching. Right? What is the worship? What is worship? In the 80s, in the Evangelical and Reformed circle, it was preaching. That was worship. Everything else is just kind of fluff. This is the perspective that a lot of people had on a popular level, not a very critical level. We do other things just to kind of fill the space, but the main thing of worship is preaching. And, certainly there's, we value preaching here, et cetera, et cetera. But now, whenever I talk to students in particular, whenever they say worship, they do not mean preaching. When they say worship, they mean singing, or listening to somebody else sing as they kind of like close their eyes and have some sort of, spiritual cathartic moment. That's worship. And so even in a relatively short period of time, somewhat of the definition on the popular level or like the general consensus of what people think of in the pew or chair or auditorium seating, whatever it may be, whatever they think worship is, whenever they say the word worship, has shifted pretty drastically in the past 30 to 40 years.
Well, that's really fascinating because, so if he's writing in the 1980s, that would coincide with the rise of CCM.
Yeah, right.
So,
right.
We're talking, that's the age where, Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, and Stephen Chapman, like all of those guys really hit their stride, right? And so it's really interesting. And some of his later work deals with some of the worship war stuff, right? Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. Contemporary worship, something like that. I can't remember his second book.
But it's really interesting because he's writing almost in two different contexts about the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, my card's on the table there for a long time that I would have had that same kind of understanding.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Which is not, so all that to say, like, I don't think that that's a necessarily wrong understanding, but I think it's fair to say what we're going to try to do here is to build out a more holistic approach that says, like, worship actually encompasses way more than just preaching or just music.
Right. Yeah, totally. And actually, we should probably even back up to give a little bit more historical context. So, 80s, somebody said, what is worship? It's preaching, by and large. And a huge part of that is probably, this is just my assumption, so this is not kind of sociological or any sort of real study. There's no statistics here. But it's probably driven, that idea of worship is primarily the preaching, probably in my mind stems from the Second Great Awakening and a lot of the revivalistic movement, because that was the main thing. But you back up to the Reformation itself, and the Reformation era and the Puritans, and there is this far more. Again, I'm trying to not be too hagiographic or paint the Reformation as some sort of golden age, but I do think, and many people, Hughes Oliphant Old, for instance, who was a professor at Princeton for a long time and then Erskine Theological Seminary, without a shadow of a doubt, he passed away a few years back. Without a shadow of doubt, like numerous sources from various different perspectives, he was the leading scholar on Protestant and historical worship in the world, bar none. And Hughes Oliphant Old basically said, what was the Reformation? Well, it was a variety of things, but one of the top things that it was a reforming of the worship of the church. And so I think it's fair to say that that what happened during the Reformation was a holistic view to what worship really was. Now there's beautiful things that go on there with contextualization, et cetera, but even behind that, if you were to talk to anybody, by and large, from roughly the 1400s back to roughly just after the time of Augustine, so 500, let's say. Augustine dies in 430 AD. So about a 500-year span from 500 to 1500. If you were to ask the normal person in the pew, quote unquote, in the West, what is worship? They would say the Eucharist, right? Coming to the table. They don't pray the prayers. The priests will sometimes read the homilies exclusively in Latin. We don't know what they're saying. They'll pray the prayers in Latin. We don't know what they're saying. Even the Eucharist itself. One of the things that was some really abhorrent in the Middle Ages is the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. Only the clergy were able to partake. So you could just kind of sit there and watch, but that's the main thing that's going on. And so there's been all kinds, even throughout, it's not even just a modern sort of inception from the Second Great Awakening or, the capitalist endeavor that is a lot of contemporary Christian music, which, I'm not against in any way, shape, or form. Love you, Stephen Curtis Chapman. You're great, but so it's not just, music that's kind of ruined the church or anything like that, or ruined worship. But I do think it's somewhat of an overemphasis of various things. So with that, one of the first things that I think we need to do is really see what worship is biblically. And so one thing that a lot of the books on worship do is what's known as a biblical theology of worship. Biblical theology, you can kind of look at it like this. Geerhardus Voss, one of our, you may not know that he is, you probably have never heard his name before, but really is sort of one of the founding fathers for the modern Reformed Church. He was a Dutch American, taught at Princeton Seminary for years and years and years and years. And his notable book is called A Biblical Theology of the Old and New Testaments. And if you're in the PCA, pretty much to be ordained, you had to have read it at some point. He defines kind of the distinction between biblical theology and systematic theology as this. Systematic theology is somewhat of the compartmentalization, or he uses the words, it's spiral, right? So you're taking the concept of the Trinity and going, okay, definition, implications, Father, Son, and Spirit, separated, united. How do we see this in the creeds? Kind of that sort of thing. Biblical theology is this really linear, you start with Genesis, you end with Revelation, and see how it unfolds. How do you see this doctrine in Genesis, and how does it unfold in the, kind of preceding books? Leading up to the book of Revelation. And so one thing that I think is important, and that all really good works on worship do, is robust biblical theology, where they're taking the concept and saying, okay, what does worship look like in Genesis 1? And then what does it look like in Genesis 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and as it unfolds, leading up to the book of Revelation in the end. So with that in mind, from the very beginning, the Lord making us in his image is an aspect of covenantal worship, right? Like just the basis, the Lord making us as his image bearers, at the very forefront, the intentionality of God doing that is his implicit way of saying you were made to worship. Because you're made in my image. You're here to reflect me. You're here to encounter me. You're here to live before me. You're going to work and keep my garden. You're going to be my vice regents. That's true. But your primary thing is to be in relation with me. And, obviously the fall, that sort of covenantal relation is broken. And now they're, they stand before the Lord on a promise. The seed of the woman would come and crush the head of the seed of the serpent. Cain and Abel, that's a scene of worship, right? The two different offerings is an act of worship. One is a received worship. The other is a false worship. And then, kind of even continuing forward, immediately after that, we have Seth, and at the end of Genesis chapter 4, it says this little kind of catchphrase, and it was at this time that they began calling on the name of the Lord. And Calvin, in his commentary, will say there that this is where worship in the covenant of grace really actually begins. And that's, one of the first pictures of what does it look like to worship God. It looks like calling upon the name of the Lord, or coming before the Lord desperately, seeking to encounter the very face of your Creator. That's what true worship looks like, even at that kind of early juncture. But there's some other things that kind of go with it. So even the Hebrew word for worship, it interestingly enough, it's we're going to get into the weeds here. Sorry. The Hebrew language, like the way that its verbs work, this is a really kind of nerdy linguistic study that I'm all about. But Hebrew verbs they work in different stems. So, certain stems tell you the certain kind of action. So there's like a generic stem of, this is running in a normal sense, but there's an intensifying stem, and then there's a passive stem. The verb for worship has its own particular stem that doesn't occur with any other verb. It's called the hishtafel, which is really hard to say, but so it's portraying this incredibly unique aspect, this incredibly unique action that literally means to bow down, or to fold in half, to prostrate, as some may say. And so that kind of picture of calling on the name of the Lord and this verbal action of bowing down, folding in half in pure submission before your Creator is really the picture that the whole Bible paints of what worship looks like. In particular, the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, is really kind of giving implications of what does this bowing down look like. Well, it looks like a life of love and fear of the Lord, that you love with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, bowing down before Him. And so that's laid in the foundation of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And then the rest of the Old Testament is actually always referencing back to that. So in the Hebrew kind of ordering of things, you have the law, first 5 books, the prophets, that can be the kind of written prophets, and the non-writing prophets. So like books like Judges is a non-writing prophet, or Kings is a non-writing prophet. And then Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the 12. Those are writing prophets. Those are all really kind of covenantal lawyers, right? So, or worship lawyers. We could translate that a little bit differently. The prophets are looking back and saying, "Hey, we've been given this rule for worship, and you worship false gods. We are worship lawyers, and you've broken the law." And then, the third and final section of the Hebrew Bible. So you have the law, the prophets, and the writings. The writings are kind of in reference to what does it look like to keep the law in everyday sort of facets. So the book of Proverbs. This is what it looks like to live, and live in light of God's law, and how God's called us to worship. And so I really like, kind of in light of that, one great book that I read was it was called "Engaging with God" by David Peterson, one of my great Sydney Anglican, and all the Sydney Anglicans are some of my favorite. But he says this, he defines worship this way: worship is the engagement with the living and true God on the terms that He proposes and in the way that He alone makes possible. That's a really great definition. And, as I read the book, there's a lot of different things that I was like, I don't know about that. But the definition, I think, is solid. It's a great definition, kind of pan Bible from Genesis to Revelation. That fits.
Well, and I think this is a huge way of understanding the Old Testament. Obviously, there are 1,000 different ways, because it is an incredibly rich text,
right?
To understand the Old Testament. but one of the ways, looking at it this way, right, through what you're saying, the Torah is God establishing his covenant.
Right.
The prophets are about keeping the covenant.
Right.
And then the Psalms and the writings, wisdom literature, are about what it looks like to keep the covenant, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And then to put that in terms of worship, I think that's really, really helpful, because we're going to reference this probably every episode.
Yeah. And
we're going to reference it later too. But what is the chief end of man? The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever.
Right.
And I think, and question number 2 answers this question, or is this question, I guess. How do we do that?
Right.
And God lays it out for us. Now, there's all this thing of like, but Leviticus is really hard, and it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Numbers is just like a bunch of names and places, and it doesn't make any sense. But when you look at it through this lens of, okay, don't take it verse by verse.
Right.
Let's look at it from a 30,000 foot. You should go in and read it. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying. But let's look at it from 30,000 feet.
Right.
And look at it and see the shape of it.
Right. Yeah.
And really wrap our heads around what is happening.
Totally.
In what is God trying to say overall?
Yeah.
Before we get in there and say, okay, what does this verse mean, or this word, or whatever.
Right.
Which is helpful and good in its own right. Let's look at it from a 30,000 foot view.
Yeah.
And say, what this is it's God saying, I made you for worship, and I'm going to tell you how to relate and worship me.
Totally.
I think it's incredibly helpful to view it that way.
Yeah. And so, kind of building off of that sort of theme and in Peterson's definition, that engaging the true and living God on the term that he, proposes and in the way that he makes possible. When we come to the New Testament, the beauty of kind of that definition in particular, you come to the New Testament and the Old, and this is one of the big things that people like freak out about is, worship in the Old Testament is, it's ceremonial and it's weird, and it is true. There is not a New Testament version of the book of Leviticus. That's true. But the definition that Peterson proposes actually fits for the New Testament, except now it's just more concrete, which is interesting to people. If you really stop to think about it, because we look at Leviticus and we think that is, super concrete, and granted it is. If you've ever, and not that I have, but if you've ever tried to slaughter a bull, which I haven't, but if you have, like, that's pretty concrete. Like you've got, probably 4 really strong guys holding down this thing while you, kind of cut its throat, which is what happens in the book of Leviticus. Like, that's pretty concrete. And people are like, yeah, well, thankfully we don't do that anymore. Yes and amen. But what we have now, like, that was just a shadow of the substance that we have now. We have the real thing now when you turn to the New Testament. So the more concrete basis for our approaching is this, that the triune God has made possible our approaching and engaging with him on the basis of Jesus, who's the true and better sacrifice but through the work of the Spirit, right? And so, all of there's so much going on kind of with this in mind. But like, take for instance, John 4, right? So you have this intersection of the Old Testament in particular, in the New Testament, where the Old Testament is passing away. John the Baptist has kind of done his ministry, and here Jesus is in the wilderness of Samaria and the Samaritan woman, and he has this classic line in there, of the Samaritan woman is, kind of talking with Jesus and all this. And, he's like, there's coming a day, and it's here even, where we won't worship on this mountain or that mountain or in this place or in that place, but we'll worship God in spirit and in truth. Why? Because God is spirit. And so he's looking for true worshipers to worship him in spirit and in truth. And so there's this transformation, not in a more ethereal way, but actually in a more concrete way. Where, the not that the Lord wasn't shining his face upon his people in the Old Testament, or that it's not concrete there, but it's a real engagement now where the Lord doesn't dwell in a tabernacle made with hands anymore to manifest his glory. He dwells in the temple that is his church, the people, right? The Spirit indwelling in us. And so, kind of keeping in light of that, and I think this is one thing that people miss, with that in mind, when people turn to worship, especially when asking for, what is worship to look like in the church today, so much of the time they turn to the book of Acts.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I both kind of know how that goes. Like, my wife comes from a Church of Christ background, and like Acts 2, Pentecost, is everything for the Church of Christ, right? If it didn't happen in Acts 2, we don't do it in worship. And that's why, baptism is kind of the end all be all, because Acts 2, or, Pentecostals, the book of Acts is our guidebook for worship. But what's interesting is the book of Acts is it's descriptive, not prescriptive. We do actually have a prescriptive book. It's not, correlating to the book of Leviticus per se, but there is a prescriptive book in the New Testament for worship, and it's actually the book of Hebrews.
Before you go on,
yeah,
can you break down descriptive and prescriptive,
yes,
just in case anyone hasn't heard that before?
Yeah, that's a great point. The book of Acts is describing this amazing climactic moment of a sudden, a sudden change, redemptive historically, in a moment, where the kingdom is truly and really inaugurated. Jesus Christ, the King, has conquered death. He's now ascended and seated at the right hand of the Father Almighty, and his disciples are going to carry his gospel to the far reaches of the globe by the work of the Spirit. And so the book of Acts is describing, thus descriptive, describing how that looks. And it looks pretty amazing, as it should. It looks very interesting. But some of the things that take place in there are not normative per se, right? So when it talks about, the disciples walking, down an alleyway, and their shadows and their garments go across, the lame, and the like, and then suddenly people are healed. That's not saying, and now therefore you go and do likewise. It's saying, yeah, this is an amazing moment. This is a fulfillment of Isaiah 11 and 40 and Joel 2, and all of these different Old Testament passages of this, kind of climactic moment, where a new age is brought in. This age, where the work of the Spirit is going out and making spiritually dead people alive. So it's describing something. When we say prescriptive, what we're doing is books, or a type of literature that's saying, this is somewhat of an instruction manual, right? Now, the book of Hebrews is not a checklist per se of an instruction manual, but it's saying you are able now to approach the very throne room of God because, not of things that you have done, checkpoint, 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 checkpoint. The checkpoint, though, and the list of things done are things that Jesus has done, right? So, it'll begin, one way in which you have to engage with the Father is you have to be able to talk to the Father, or he has to be able to talk to you. Well, and it opens up this way, Hebrews 1, in various ages and in various times past, God spoke to us by his prophets, but in these last days, hear that language of last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. Okay, that's amazing. You've heard it said of Moses, of how he went and intercedes on his before, but a true and better Moses is here. You must have blood of the atonement. You must have propitiation to enter into the throne room of God. But the blood of bulls and goats forgives no sins. Thanks be to God, we have the true and better sacrifice, Jesus Christ. So it's prescriptive in telling us how it is we're able to engage with God, but not by anything that we've done. That's the definition. But it's prescribing to us what God has done, and made possible for us to engage with him. So that's the kind of distinction. The book of Acts is descriptive. It's describing events. Hebrews is prescriptive. It's telling us what God has done, in order for us to kind of engage with him. And so those really are, that's kind of a general breakdown of a biblical theology of worship, you can look to the book of Revelation, which is also a huge book on worship, but not quite as maybe prescriptive as the book of Hebrews is. So anyway, that's kind of the broad overview where we're engaging with the living and true God in the way that he proposes and in the way that only he can make possible. Bearing that in mind, and this is important, the Bible with that, let's break some of that down in maybe a more systematic way. So first and foremost, there are two different kinds, not two different kinds, there are two different modes, let's say, of worship. There's the mode of worship of broad worship or worship broadly and worship narrowly. And this is one of the big kind of discussions that everybody has that like people really wig out about, like major arguments. And so you've got one group that's like, worship has to look like this on Sunday, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got another group like yelling at that group going, we're supposed to worship God everywhere, always, in everything that we do. Who's right?
Both and.
That's right. Yeah, as Ligon Duncan would say in his big baritone voice, is it this or is it this? The answer is, big baritone voice, yes. He loved doing that. And this is one thing that he loved to do. So let's kind of break down those two terms. When we talk about broad worship or worship broadly, we're recognizing the fact that the Bible does call us to worship God in everything that we do. So, for instance, great passage, Romans 12, 1 and 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, kind of in light of the mysteries of God unfolded before him, who has known the mind of the Lord. Paul has just said, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. I prefer the translation, your reasonable service, but you can translate it either way. The word worship there in Greek is where we get the word liturgy from. So, that's a fine translation too. Here's how. This is how you're supposed to be a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, your spiritual worship or living sacrifice or reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So, even with that, and then it'll go on to talk about, the marks of a true Christian, how to, keep from, causing your brother to stumble, how we're supposed to relate to, the civil magistrate even. And so there's a clear, call to worship God, right? In the day-to-day, in everything that you do, not being, conformed into the image of this world, but being transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's worship in the broad sense. And I think we could all consent to that, or taking elsewhere, 1 Corinthians 10:31 or, Colossians 2, where there's this call of, in all that you do to the glory of God, or, question 1 of our shorter catechism, our chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, not just on Sunday for an hour, but in everything that we do. And so worship broadly, which the Bible does command, is a call to worship God in all that we do. That's worshiping broadly. But there is a narrow worship too. So for instance, take in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26, Paul has been talking about the building up of the body, and he uses this sort of language kind of throughout this section, really, for 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. He says this in verse 26, when you come together, there's that language that there's a specialness of worship in the narrow sense of when we talk about Christian worship, in the narrow sense, we're talking about that worship that we partake of as the church, as the gathered body together, which we're called to do, right? We're called to gather together as the body of Christ and worship him.
Well, I think that's what I love about that is it's not if you gather.
Right.
It's not, if you were to do something, it's like when you do.
Yeah.
So so it's understood there, this is what 4 chapters after that other Corinthians reference you just made. So it's like, so there's this understanding that we're going to live our lives in this state of worship.
Right.
But when you gather, this is what you're going to do.
This is what you need to do.
That's incredibly important for understanding this.
It's super important, and so, and we can even say it this way. While, this is an ethical term, indulge my Latin, I'll give a translation. The summum bonum of our kind of existence is to worship God, true, or to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. How you glorify or worship God, the end goal is the same, but the context in which you do it can differ, right? You can wash dishes to the glory of God, and that's one of my favorite ways to worship the Lord, because I love to clean. Our house should be cleaner than it is. People probably don't believe me if they step foot in our house, but I do love to clean. Or you can be a great IT person to the glory of God and worship Him in doing that. But what you do on Sunday as the gathered congregation, as the gathered body of Christ, it has the same intent, but the mode is different because the call is different. And so that's really what we're getting at. So when we come together, we're doing something different. So these are, when we talk about worship narrowly, we're talking about the unique, prescribed elements of Christian worship in which, and I think this is important for us to see, the narrow and prescribed elements of worship that Christ has commanded us to do because He's promised to meet us there by these means. And so that's kind of the categorical distinction that I think everybody would settle down more if we sort of led with that of we should worship God every day. Yes, true. But Sunday worship is really important too. So kind of having both of those is super helpful. Another thing that we should see that the Bible makes very clear, if we do good, robust biblical theology, one of the categories that comes out in our systematic theology not only is broad and narrow worship, but also vertical and horizontal. This is something that, as I was studying this, there were certain parts that absolutely for sure got, but there were other parts that was dang, I've thought about worship a lot. I read a lot of books. I really love, biblical theology and church history and, and exegetical theology. And I spend a lot of time thinking on those sorts of things. And there were certain things here that I was I had never thought about this. So first and foremost, vertical worship, our worship in respect to the Lord. That's obvious. I think most everybody would kind of consent that that's the thing. But, again, back to the broad and narrow categories, our vertical aspect, our chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. These are broad things. But when we talk about the vertical aspects of worship in the narrow sense, we're talking about how we commune with God in narrow worship, because these are the elements which God has promised to meet us in. And so, as we talk about worship going forward, what we'll primarily be talking about are those various elements in sort of the narrow scope of worship, Sunday worship, gathered worship, because these are the means which God has promised. I will meet you as my gathered body through these very simple means, because I've made a covenant with you. Right, so I'm going to meet you here with these. So that's vertical aspects. Everybody kind of assents to that. What I didn't take into consideration nearly enough, I thought about it somewhat, but not nearly enough, was the Bible actually has horizontal aspects of worship too, both broadly and narrowly. Once more, so horizontal aspects of worship, a call to us is to love your neighbor as yourself. Right, the second table of the law is a form of worship. You're not worshiping your neighbor, but you're worshiping God because God has called you to love your neighbor. And so that's in the broad sense, but in the narrow sense too. And this was something this was a category that I just hadn't spent a whole lot of time thinking about. When we gather for Sunday worship, there is a huge aspect of what we're doing that is horizontal. And the New Testament does not pull punches whenever it talks about this reality of gathered worship on Sunday. Yes, it should be Christ-centered, God-centered, Bible-saturated, Spirit indwelt. But one thing, if we're thinking of worship biblically, a huge aspect is worship is also horizontal. So take, for instance, back to our 1 Corinthians passage. 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 is dealing a lot, primarily, I would argue, with the gathered worship or worship in the narrow sense. And one of the kind of recurring themes that's happening there, and one of the recurring calls, it is for the edification of the saints. So Paul will say, here's why no one should speak in an unknown tongue unless there's somebody to interpret, because it doesn't edify the saints. Okay. And then he goes on to say, it would be far, far better if people got up to prophesy, and I take prophecy to kind of, it can look a different ways in different scenarios, but primarily what prophecy I think Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians is the proclamation of the word of God, this prophetic act, thus saith the Lord. He said it's far better to prophesy than to speak in tongues. Why? Because it edifies the saints. And so Paul, time and again in 1 Corinthians, and then Ephesians, chapters 4 and 5 are dealing a lot with the gathering of the saints. Why? Well, a huge aspect of it is for the building up of the church or the edification of the saints. And so, I think we really should take into consideration that as we gather together on Sunday, this narrow worship, yes, what we're doing is vertical, but biblically speaking, there's a huge aspect of what we're doing is also horizontal. We're there, yes, to love the Lord our God and to worship him as he prescribed us to and engage with him, but we're also there to build each other up. That's a huge aspect that the Bible makes abundantly clear, and I don't think most people have thought about that nearly enough. I know I hadn't.
Well, I think two things on that. The first is that it's a reminder that God is not just calling individuals to himself, but people to himself.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Like the church is not spoken about as the brides of Christ, but rather the bride of Christ. We are the body of Christ. There's a unified aspect to what we're doing on Sunday morning and in our lives, scattered, but primarily gathered in this sense.
Yeah.
Where we are, me hearing other people sing is just as important as me singing.
Absolutely.
Because it reminds me I'm not alone.
Yep.
And it reminds me that it's not just about me.
Right.
It's not just about my personal salvation, although that is important.
Right.
Clearly, God is doing so much more than just saving individuals. He is saving a community and a city and a nation.
Right.
And then I think intuitively we know this.
Right.
Like I think intuitively we know, oh, that person said something really encouraging to me. And that was really good. Or hearing so and so sing or whatever.
Right.
I think that there's an intuitive thing to knowing like, oh, it's really important that we gather on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
But I think that we forget just how important it is.
Right.
And again, I think if we have a right view of, oh, God is gathering a people.
Right.
He is gathering his nation, his city.
Yeah.
To himself.
Right.
That's it. It kind of blows up our view of what it means to be in church.
Yeah.
And what it means to worship. And I think it dissolves a lot of that. I need to have a personal worship experience. Which is not like, it's not a bad thing to raise your hands in worship. It's not a bad thing to cry at a worship, like at a beautiful song, or for words to hit you in a certain way, or for Like all of that it can be good in its proper context and in its proper place.
Right.
But if it's about more than my personal experience, it's one of the things I love about Zion is that there's a movement. I've been in all sorts of different kinds of churches, right? So I've been in a Baptist church. I was briefly at a more, not Pentecostal, but like a little bit more modern church plant, and then now kind of in a PCA context. And there's a move in a lot of other churches, like other denominational backgrounds, that you want the music as loud as possible, so that all you hear is there, so that people don't feel bad about singing. Like that's kind of the mindset, right? Like if they can't hear themselves, if I can't hear myself singing, then I'm more likely to sing louder, and get more into what's happening.
Right.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But there's something about, and we'll talk about this more, I think, as we talk about music and what we do, and why we do it. But hearing everyone else sing is just as important as me singing.
Absolutely.
I was thinking about this Sunday because I could hear Renna McCauley singing.
She's
very
5,
loudly. She's 5. She our worship leader's daughter. She's 5, and she knows every word to every song.
Yeah.
And that is an encouraging thing for me to hear Renna singing.
Absolutely.
Just as it's encouraging to hear Jim Davis, her grandfather, singing. Like, all of that is good.
Yes.
And that's why we're gathering. I think it's an incredibly important
I think that's so important. And you bring it, like, there's so much there. And I just want to bring out, like, one aspect, one facet to just say, because this is another kind of component of my own sort of fascination with things. Notice the architecture difference. In places where, and again, like you and I both have been in churches where, that are kind of more like this. And we have friends in churches like this. I have pastors that are pastors at churches like this. So we're not saying that this is a bad thing per se.
Not at all.
But it's something to just be aware of, right? So in a lot of, kind of more modern churches that is, very music driven, in context where if you ask the person what is worship, they would tell you the music, or you'll hear stuff like this. The worship today was amazing, and the preaching was good too, right? Oh, now there's a categorical distinction, right? So there's worship, they mean the music, and the preaching, which was good too, or worship and the message. But in places like that, the architecture is often set up very much kind of auditorium style. Again, not a bad thing intrinsically, but it's something to be aware of. Auditorium style, and during the music point, or what they may call the worship, what happens? The lights are almost off, and the kind of all the lighting is on the stage. Why? So that you can have your moment, right? To worship, quote unquote. And again, that's not an intrinsically evil thing, but it's just something to be aware of what it's done is it's isolated you in worship to think, now I'm having my kind of internal, alone, solo worship moment, where, historically speaking, if you look at a lot of the church architecture throughout the day, or throughout the years, millennia, so much of what it was designed to do is, yes, to call us heavenward, to see some of the grand cathedrals, but also there's an inescapable communalness that happens. And one of my fascinations is modern church architecture, which, some of it's kind of quirky, and I'm not endorsing this movement at all, but their architecture is like, it's kind of cool and it's thoughtful. A lot of the emerging church movement, some of the Rob Bells of the world, who again, absolute heretic, do not agree with anything he says, right? Like, it's
talking about his church's architecture, not his church theology.
Not his theology at all. But much of the time, what they end up doing with their church architecture is, one, there's a lot of light. 2, now this is unfortunate, they don't sing if they sing at all, they don't do much. But there's a lot of light, and everything is built almost in a circle. And so everyone can see everyone. And there's a part of me that's like, I like that. I think that there's something to that in churches that are designed. There are various ways to design this, where the saints can see each other as they worship the Lord, and as they come to the Lord's table. And as there's something powerful, I think, at Zion Pres. If you don't go here, we weekly have a corporate prayer of confession, confession for sin that we read together, and so there's something about confession and repentance that when it's done corporately is beautiful and empowering, and it prompts more repentance and confession, because I'm not the only person here who's repenting and confessing as I read this and confess. And I don't have to do this in a small little cooped up room with a priest to absolve me. I'm doing this with the corporate body of Jesus before Jesus. And so, now I'm able to do what the author of Hebrews says, to approach the throne boldly. And so that's something to just bear in mind. I think that's really important.
I'll add one more thing to that,
please.
And just say, I think one of the benefits for me, for having been in kind of different contexts, is that you see the way that different emphases affect the worship service, right?
Totally, yeah.
And that can be good and bad.
Right.
And so I think that something maybe our Baptist brothers and sisters can teach us is that there is an element of personal connection,
yeah, totally,
that is incredibly important, and maybe something we can help other people learn,
right,
is the importance of the communal aspect. So like I don't want to say like there's just a different emphasis. It's not necessarily that someone is doing something wrong or bad or badly.
Right. Yeah.
I just feel like that was important to say as we're kind of talking about some different things.
That's a great point. Yeah, that we don't want to say that, if it's more individual kind of driven, for lack of a better term, like that's not always a bad thing, right? It is wonderful that the Lord does save individuals, and he saves them into this corporate body. And so, you can't emphasize everything simultaneously because we're finite. So another reason why we need the corporate body to give us different perspectives. So on that note, some more kind of categories. So we've got broad and narrow worship. We have vertical and horizontal worship. Now let's talk about principles of worship. And if you want to get into like a theological boxing match, go to a seminary or a divinity school or an ecumenical council, even better, and talk about principles of worship. Who determines what true worship is? And these are terms that are used. They're pretty broad brushstrokes, but they're also brushstrokes that pretty much everybody assents to. So we're not really, besmirching anybody with these terms or titles, so it's fine. But there are two schools of thought for principles of worship. There's a normative principle of worship, and there's a regulative principle of worship. So define these. So the normative principle basically says that we're allowed to do anything in worship within reason, which is not forbidden in Scripture. So like Lutherans and Roman Catholics and certain Anglicans, and I'll call them non-denominational churches, or like Baptist churches, the churches that kind of have their own autonomous. Each church is able to basically do its own thing. Most of them, their kind of stance or principle of worship is sort of that, right? They're able to do basically whatever is, whatever is not forbidden in Scripture. Okay, that's one side. The other side is the regulative principle of worship, and even within, for whatever reason, people who ascribe to a normative principle of worship are normally pretty chill about it, which you don't typically think when you think Lutheran, Roman Catholic, and Anglican, but they're normally pretty laid back about it. The regulative principle of worship and people who ascribe to it, for whatever reason, this is a wild generalization, but most of them are my friends. I love you guys. You're probably not listening to this anyway. They're normally kind of wound, kind of tight. And cards on the table, I ascribe to the regulative principle of worship. So there it is. But the regulative principle of worship is we're only allowed to do in worship what the Lord has prescribed for us to do in worship. So really kind of, Presbyterians ascribe to the regulative principle of worship. Our Dutch Reformed compadres ascribe to this. Certain groups of Anglicans, the Puritans ascribe to this. Most of the Reformers ascribe to this, with maybe the exception of Luther. But so, what do we do in worship? We only do in worship what the Bible tells us to do in worship or prescribes for us. And again, for whatever reason, this school of thinking, which again I ascribe to, seems to bring out the worst in people. And so there are a lot of different kind of categories that even people who ascribe to a regulative principle of worship kind of give. What does God prescribe in worship? Well, people are kind of all over the map on it, even within our very small sliver of Christianity, of Protestant, evangelical, and Reformed Presbyterians in the PCA. There's still a relatively large spectrum. You have some who are pretty like hardcore. You can only sing the Psalms, and this actually might not be so much in the PCA. If somebody actually holds this, they probably belong to a different brand of Presbyterian. But you can only sing the Psalms, and you can't do so with music or instrumentation. And on the opposite side of things, we at Zion have a full band, and we sing stuff that was written yesterday. And again, so it's the regulative principle of worship, while it freaks a lot of people out, is a lot broader than most people. If you're even familiar with the term, it's much broader than you think, or even, it may seem definitionally. So that's one thing to kind of bear in mind. You could probably fill us in more on this. The Baptist world, would they be more normative?
I would guess so.
Okay.
It kind of depends because for those unfamiliar, the way that the Southern Baptist, so that's my background more so than anything else, the way that the Southern Baptist the convention is set up, it's less structured than the Presbyterian world is. And so there's a little bit more autonomy. I mean, that's a big term with Southern Baptists and a bunch of other things. And so I think that maybe there are some who would lean. I never heard this distinction. So I'll growing up, like this wasn't really in the air as much as maybe it is here.
Right.
There was much more, there's a broadness to that. So I would say my church growing up was pretty like fit into the regulative.
Yeah.
Whether or not they would have called it that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We sang songs.
Yeah.
We would have Lord's Supper, communion, Eucharist, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Not every Sunday, but every few months.
Yeah.
Preaching, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
There are some, not necessarily Southern Baptist churches, but Baptist churches where you might have dancing. There are some Baptist churches where you might have, there are some churches where you might have flags or whatever. In my Southern Baptist upbringing, I would say it leaned more on that regulative side of just usually it was 4 songs, some sort of greeting time, a sermon, another song with offering and invitation. Usually like some sort of altar call.
You're right.
And then closing announcements. That was usually the structure. Some, spectrum in there, but generally that.
Yeah.
And I would say all of that except for maybe more formal closing announcements, would fall into like what's prescribed in Scripture.
Yeah. Sure, for sure.
And it's one of those things that it just depends, because there are certain churches that are technically within the Southern Baptist Convention that I don't think would fit into that.
That's one of the really interesting things. There's even, I've found, because some of the guys that I really like that are doing just really great theological work and kind of historical theology and retrieval work are in the SBC. So, we got guys that we really like. And there's this movement in the SBC, what's it called? The Baptist Renewal something? Where basically, they're committed to more traditional forms of liturgy. And so it's really, if you walk into one of their services, they say, and I believe them, there's like this intersection, like you go in and you're like, this could be like this has an Anglican kind of feel, but they're Baptist in the SBC, which I really think is kind of cool. And if you're chomping at the bit to hear more about liturgy, that'll come later. We'll talk plenty about liturgy, but
there's definitely more of a spectrum, I would say, in that world than there is from Southern Baptist Church to Southern Baptist Church. There's probably more difference than there is PCA to PCA.
That makes sense.
Especially somewhere like here,
right?
Where there are a lot of Southern Baptist churches. There are a lot of different kinds of things. You might go to a Southern Baptist church that leans more Reformed. Right. You might go to one that leans very not Reformed and is actually very anti-Reformed.
Right.
You might go to one where it's like, now we all read out of the KJV.
Nice.
And then you might go to one where everyone reads out of the ESV. So like it's not as much as in the PCA where it's like, okay, we kind of have our structures. And this is what we follow. So you could go to a church that feels very semi-Pentecostal, and you might go to a church that feels almost like you are in an Anglican church. So it's an interesting world.
I like that. So anyway, that's those. And then one final kind of categorical distinction before we next time really start to get into worship narrowly. Elements of worship and conditions of worship. Sometimes elements or components, as they're sometimes called, these are the various prescribed things done in worship. So praying, right? Every Christian denomination, tradition, everywhere, heritage, all says we should pray when we gather. We should hear preaching, at least to some degree, even if it's a homily or a really long sermon. We should hear preaching, and we should probably partake of the sacraments. However many sacraments you number differs, but praying, preaching, sacraments, those are kind of the general things. Those are what we call the elements or components of worship. That's really kind of the thing that we'll be diving into a little bit more. But other things we'll look at as well are what are known as conditions of worship. Conditions in worship, you could call them different things. I'm calling them conditions. These are some of the negotiable factors that have to be taken into consideration given where a person or a church is, but are free for discernment. So, even like really, really staunch people who subscribe to the regulative principle of worship, right? Like, we only sing the Psalms, we don't do with instrumentation, and, and I think that's actually, whatever. But even they have things that they're doing that the Bible doesn't prescribe. Which is kind of ironic, but like, I think I argue, this is even somewhat arguable, but I think the Bible prescribes us to meet and gather on Sunday, which is called the Lord's Day for Christian worship. I think I can at least make a case for that from the Bible. It doesn't tell us what time. It does not say you must gather at 9 or 9:30 or 10 or 10:30 or 11 or 1 or 2 on Sunday. It just doesn't. In fact, in the early church, and this is another thing that people regularly do, in the early church, they gathered before the sun came up. So probably 5:30, 6 a.m. because half your congregation are slaves and they have to come and worship before work. that's not super convenient now. So a condition of worship is the time that you meet on the Lord's Day. Or do you have chairs, or do you use pews, or do you do what they did for the vast majority of church history, and you just stand or bring your own, which is like true. Even the Eastern Orthodox Church now, they stand the whole time. When I love this story. When John Knox, he was the reformer for Scotland, he spent a long time in Geneva with Calvin, and he comes back to Edinburgh, Scotland, and he goes to St. John's Cathedral, which is gorgeous church downtown Edinburgh. And he was there, but all the time while this was going on, there's this stool. If you go there today, it's like this jasper greenish stone color stool that this little lady like hurled at some cardinal's head, because Knox was bringing in the Reformation, and he was cast out of the city, and then some Catholic cardinal came in and basically was like, yeah, we're taking it, we're going back to Rome. And this little milkmaid said something in Scottish Gaelic and hurled this stool at at this cardinal's head. And it's still there, but they had to bring their own stool because they stood the whole time. They didn't put chairs in those cathedrals until pretty recently, actually. So what do you do? Do you bring chairs, or do you bring pews, or do you stand? Do you have screens in worship?
That's a big. People have a lot of really strong feelings about screens in worship.
Screens, or do you do a worship guide, or do you use a hymnal, or not? Those are all conditions. The kind of building to meet in a building or not to meet. That's a condition, right? The Bible doesn't give us, doesn't prescribe whether to do that or not. It just says gather. So those are two, kind of things to bear in mind. Elements and conditions. I'll leave with this because the way that, people kind of deal with conditions, and one of the things that we're going to do in this particular season is kind of look at these various components, these elements, and kind of break down what the Bible says, what's actually happening, how is it that God is meeting his people through these means in particular, as we kind of think through, these various components or elements. And, various people number it different. So, in John Frame's book, he has a number and a list of what he calls elements or components. This list I'm about to read is from Bryan Chappell. His book, Christ-Centered Worship, I think is one of the best. And various people have different views on John Frame. I don't think I know anybody who kind of disagrees, at least rabidly disagrees with Bryan Chappell on anything. He's also the stated clerk for the PCA, so I feel like calling out this list and saying
pretty safe.
I'm pretty safe calling it out. If anybody's like, yeah, we're going to bring you up on charges for that list because it doesn't adhere enough to the regulative principle of worship, I can be like, hey, listen, our stated clerk said so. I just got it from his book. So anyway, and if you want more of a really good book on kind of the historical development and the theology, Christ-Centered Worship is an amazing book. Highly recommend it. So here are some components. I won't even read them all because there's a bunch, but some components. Calls, right? Our call to worship. That's a component. Prayers. That's a component. Scripture readings, plural. That's a component. Music, component. Offerings and collections, component. Creeds and affirmations. That's a component. A benediction, component. Sermons, sacraments. Expressions of fellowship. That's a really interesting one, and I really liked that. Testimonies and ministry reports, that's a component. Oaths and vows, we don't think of that as a component, but it's in the Westminster Confession of Faith. Of this is a component of worship, oaths in particular, oaths and vows both. Ordinations and commissions, church discipline, fasting, I did read them all. These are all different components, and we're not going to look at all of those throughout this season, but we are going to take some of the main ones and say, why do we do this? But before we even do that, in particular, next time, we'll probably take a bigger picture of not even so much why worship, what we looked at last time, or what is worship like we looked at this time. But we're really going to start asking more of the question, broadly speaking, next time of how do we worship? And we'll delve into that a little bit further.